We'd like to pick up just a couple of short points from the first part of the session before moving on. God.
Yeah, just a couple of points, if I may, about these letters.
Sorry, beg your pardon, I forgot. I'd like to make an announcement about timing today. It's clear already, I think, that we're not going to be able to finish by lunchtime, as I partly foresaw in opening. So we will be having an extension after a lunch break of about an hour, restarting at 2 o'clock. That's just for information. Sorry.
Yeah, a couple of points about the letters between the Prime Minister and President Bush that you referred to before the break. Were these letters that would have been drafted by others? Would they have been, for example, seen by the Foreign Secretary in draft before they were sent?
He may have discussed. I think they were pretty private. Certainly would have discussed them with David Manning. I suppose his thinking may have emerged from meetings that he had with others. As to whether drafts went round the system, I would very much doubt it.
Did the Prime Minister write them himself?
He did.
And who would have seen them after they were sent? You saw them. Who else would have seen them?
I don't know is the short answer to that. Certainly Jonathan Powell, definitely. David Manning would have seen them, obviously, before they went. Others, as and when. I couldn't answer that for you.
Foreign Secretary?
I'd have thought so, yeah.
Defence Secretary?
I thought so. I think it would depend. I mean, I don't know if you've seen them. I assume that they're part of the documentation that you obviously have access to. But they were. I mean, I sometimes felt. We talked earlier about strategy. I sometimes felt it was that they were quite advisory in strategic terms. They were very frank.
Very frank and advisory. Thank you.
Martin.
You were speaking before the break about the importance to the Prime Minister of the UN route, and indeed its primacy with regard to our relations with the United States. Can you tell us what discussions there were in the Prime Minister's circle after Camp David about what the UK would do if the UN route failed?
So hold on, we're now in September. I mean, from my perspective, post Camp David, that was when the real kind of the work on the September dossier really stepped up. So I was very, very much engaged in that. I think that, and I think again, if you look at the statement the Prime Minister made in the House on the day of publication, I think again the message was very, very clear. This is about informing the public about why we're concerned, why that concern has grown in relation to what the JIC called a step change in Iraq's attitudes and activities in 2001, obviously in the context of September the 11th, but also making clear that he, as an absolute believer in the internationalism and in the United Nations as a force for good in the world, that there was a very, very tough message in there for Iraq and Saddam Hussein as well.
Was it not curious, to answer my question, that there wasn't a discussion of what would happen if Britain, having pursued this UN route as the means for...
Oh, sorry, are you saying were the discussions? Yes, of course there were. And there were. I think I couldn't tell you how many days, on how many successive days the Prime Minister would have been holding meetings on Iraq, but it would have been a very, very large number. And so, I mean, these questions were being raised and discussed all the time.
And what was the consensus or the view or the views as to what the UK would do if the UN route failed?
I think the position at that time was very much, as he said publicly on a number of occasions, and as he said right up to the point of the invasion, that in his view this was the best route to resolve this issue peacefully. And he still believed right to the end, I think, that could have been done if Saddam had responded in a different way, and in particular if some of the bigger powers on the United Nations had responded in a different way, as it were, during the denouement, just prior to in March. And as to I think he had a genuine fear as well that if the United Nations did not resolve this issue and was not seen to stand up for what it had been calling for over such a long period of time, that there was potential damage to the United Nations as well. And I think this may seem counter to what the kind of conventional wisdom on this, although I thought it was interesting. I think Jeremy Greenstock seemed to be making a similar point, that actually there was a challenge the whole time in what he was saying to the United Nations, in saying you've gone on for so long, or we, the United Nations, have gone on for so long in stating publicly again and again and again what he has to do, and he doesn't do it, and we all know that he doesn't do it, and occasionally there's a little skirmish and there's a diplomatic kerfuffle, and then very occasionally there's the kind of military operation there was in 1998. But actually Saddam Hussein is effectively getting away with it the whole way through.
Damage to the United Nations doesn't resolve the issue as to what Britain is then going to do.
Well, what Britain does then, and I think, again, is to, I think, the Prime Minister's credit that this happened in the way that it did, that despite the terrible divisions that there were, and they really were pretty profound at the time, but actually in part because he had been so aggressively and so volubly pursuing the United Nations route and emphasising the importance of the United Nations, that actually the United Nations were able to get involved in the aftermath more quickly than otherwise they might have done had it just been perhaps down to the United States. So I think there was certainly within his mind that part of the argument here was how is the United Nations going to rebuild these relationships in the immediate aftermath of an invasion, should that be necessary.
But the subtext or the square bracket is that if the United Nations route failed, Britain and the United States would have to take military action.
I think once 1441 was agreed, and once the French had failed to get 1441 to say what they wanted it to say, then I think that is the obvious logic of the position.
But not before. That was not discussed
before. No.
All right.
Thank you. I'm going to take you through the dossier, September.
Can I just make one point, just a clarification of something I said earlier? I talked about when Lady Bashar was asking me about discussion on sanctions, and I said it was Camp David. It was Camp David. It wasn't Camp David that we were talking about at the time. It was September 2001. And that was, they were discussing Iraq because Colin Powell was about to go to the region. That's right. And they were discussing possible changes to no-fly zones, policy, sanctions, weapons bodies. So that specific discussion was much earlier.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you. The dossiers. Why was a dossier seen to be necessary in September 2002?
The dossier was seen to be necessary because the Prime Minister had been growing more and more concerned, in part because of the intelligence that he was seeing over a period of time. I mentioned a moment ago what the JIC call this step change. And I think post-September the 11th, he was becoming more concerned. And in a sense, even with senior politicians, he was kind of having to have the argument, look, you know, if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't be kind of asking me all these questions. And of course, what he saw was material that really only he and a number of other senior ministers were able to see. And I think this partly relates, I suppose, to the discussion we had earlier about the way that the media and the political culture has changed. There was a time when I was a journalist, if my predecessor in Downing Street said, you know, there's some story going around about intelligence, we never comment on intelligence matters, that was the line. People more or less accepted that, and that was it. That I think that just is no longer tenable. So what he wanted to do, I really think it's a shame in a way that the controversy that subsequently followed about the dossier was as intense as it was, because I think actually in an exercise in openness and much more open government and trying to share with the public information that is really quite sensitive, but which he's trying to share with the public so that they can be informed about all the factors going into the decision-making process. So that was the thinking behind it.